arrived at university, I was excited about the idea of living on campus. The thought of sharing a room with a roommate seemed like part of the quintessential college experience, something I should embrace. My roommate, Brian, seemed quiet and reserved. He wasn't exactly the sociable type, but that didn't bother me at first. I also enjoyed my space and appreciated a bit of privacy. The first few days were normal, or at least they seemed to be. Brian and I exchanged few words, mostly about trivial matters like classes, the weather, or the cafeteria food. He spent most of his time in the room, always absorbed in his own thoughts or working on something on his laptop. I assumed he just preferred solitude, but over time, I started to notice things that made me uncomfortable. Brian seemed to pay attention to details that most people would overlook. He carefully observed how I organized my things, asked odd questions about my routine, and always seemed to know when I was about to leave or return to the room. I found this a bit strange, but I tried not to worry. Maybe he was just a little more introspective than most people. Then I began to notice that some of my personal items were out of place, and that's when the discomfort started to grow. A book I always left on my nightstand was turned sideways. My hairbrush seemed to be in a different position than I had left it, and my clothes drawer looked like it had been rummaged through. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. Maybe I had moved these things without realizing it. However, as the days passed, the frequency of these small changes increased. It was as if something or someone was tampering with my belongings when I wasn't around. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was overreacting, but a sense of unease began to settle in permanently. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Brian continued to act strangely, but never in a directly threatening way. He had a habit of appearing suddenly, without me noticing his approach, and often asked questions that seemed pointless, but left me feeling uncomfortable. The atmosphere in the room began to change, becoming increasingly heavy. Weeks passed, and the sense of unease in the room only worsened. I tried to focus on my classes and studies, but every time I returned to the dorm, the tension enveloped me. Brian continued to act in odd ways, but it was hard to pinpoint exactly what bothered me. He didn't do anything overtly threatening, but the way he watched my every move was disturbing. One night, after returning to the room following a long study session at the library, I found Brian already asleep. Everything seemed normal at first, but something caught my eye in the corner of the room. There was a notebook, half hidden under Brian's pillow, with part of the cover visible. It wasn't just any notebook. I recognized it immediately as mine. I remembered leaving that notebook on my desk before I left. I felt a pang of panic, but tried to stay calm. Maybe he had borrowed it, I thought, although it was strange he hadn't mentioned anything. I decided not to confront him right then, but curiosity gnawed at me. I waited until Brian left the next morning to check the notebook. When I finally got the chance to look, I found something that made my blood run cold. The pages of the notebook were filled with detailed notes about my daily routine, when I left, when I returned, what I ate, and even who I talked to. It was as if he had been monitoring me the whole time, but what really terrified me were the personal items I found hidden between the pages. Eyelashes, small strands of hair, and even pieces of a shirt tag that I had thrown away. I was paralyzed for a moment, fear morphing into a mix of anger and panic. Why was he collecting these things? Why was he so obsessed with me? I wanted to confront him, but the thought of doing so made me even more anxious. How would he react? Was he aware of how disturbing his behavior was? I decided to confront him, but carefully. I waited until we were both back in the room that night and asked, trying to sound casual, if he had seen the notebook. Brian paused for a moment, and I could see his expression change, as if he knew what was coming. He didn't deny it. Instead, he shrugged, as if what he had done was no big deal. I was just curious, he said, offering no real explanation. The way he spoke, as if this were perfectly normal, made me even more nervous. I couldn't hold back the fear that had been eating away at me. I asked why he had made those notes, why he was collecting my personal items. He just looked at me with that empty stare and said, "You have something special, something I wanted to understand better." The coldness of his response terrified me. I was standing in front of someone who clearly didn't see anything wrong with invading my privacy in such a disturbing way. The atmosphere became unbearable for me. With every passing moment, I felt like I was in constant danger, as if something terrible was about to happen. Brian started to become even more distant, yet more intrusive at the same time. He seemed to know that I was scared and enjoyed maintaining this silent control over me. I began to notice that he was always around, as if he were watching me from some dark corner. I could hardly sleep, and when I did, I would wake up in a panic, feeling like he was in the room, watching my every move. The days following my confrontation with Brian were the hardest I'd ever lived through. Every time I returned to the room, it felt like I was walking into a trap. Brian's behavior, which had once just been strange, now seemed sinister. He became increasingly invasive, leaving strange messages in my books and belongings, small notes scribbled with phrases like, "I know what you're thinking," or "You can't hide anything from me." These messages pushed me to the brink of a breakdown. Every time I found one, it felt like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. I started avoiding the room as much as possible, staying in the library until it closed, or studying in other buildings on campus. But inevitably, I had to return. And every time I came back, the tension was suffocating. The nights became a torment. I could hardly sleep, always feeling like Brian was watching me. I heard whispers coming from his direction, indistinct words that left me even more disturbed. My paranoia grew to the point where I would check every night for any signs that he had tampered with my things while I was gone. My heart was always racing, my mind exhausted. The situation became unbearable when I found a photograph of myself, clearly taken while I was sleeping. The image was folded and placed under my pillow. The thought that he had been there, lurking, taking pictures of me while I slept, made me feel a wave of nausea and panic like never before. I no longer knew what he was capable of, and the sense of danger was inescapable. Desperate, I went to the university administration. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, but the fear was evident in my voice. I told them about Brian's disturbing behavior, the photos, the notes, and how I constantly felt threatened. I needed to get out of that room. I needed help, but the responses were disheartening. They told me that all the rooms were occupied and that I would have to wait until the next semester for a possible change. I couldn't wait until the next semester. I knew that if I stayed there, something terrible could happen. I was on the verge of leaving campus altogether, anything to escape that situation. Then I remembered a professor I had taken a few classes with, someone who seemed genuinely concerned about the well-being of students. I went to him and, with a trembling voice, told him the whole story. He listened intently, and by the end, his face was marked with a look of concern. He didn't doubt me, and that was a relief. He said he would help, and that in situations like this, the university should act immediately. Thanks to his intervention, I was moved to another dorm that same week on an emergency basis. When I returned to the room to gather my things, I did so quickly, with Brian watching in silence, not saying a word. The feeling of being closely observed made me tremble, but I knew I was one step away from escaping. I left without looking back, relieved to leave that nightmare behind. The new room was in a different building, and the atmosphere there was the complete opposite of the room I had shared with Brian. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without feeling that suffocating weight on my chest. I stayed up all night, but not out of fear, out of relief, slowly remembering that I was finally safe. Landing an internship was my top priority that semester. I was in my junior year at Washington State University in Pullman, and I knew this was my chance to gain experience and possibly secure a good job after graduation. I spent weeks sending out resumes to various companies, but so far, I hadn't received any promising responses. Then, out of the blue, I got an email from a company I didn't recognize. The message said they were impressed with my resume and wanted to interview me for an internship position. The email seemed legitimate. The company, called Orion Dynamics, had a professional name, and the language used was formal and appropriate. They mentioned that the interview would be at a cafe a little off campus, in an area of town I wasn't very familiar with. I found it a bit odd, but not unheard of. Some companies prefer more discreet locations for interviews. Either way, I was so eager to secure an internship that I decided to ignore any doubts. On the scheduled day, I prepared carefully. I put on my best suit, mentally rehearsed answers to common interview questions, and headed out to the meeting place. The interview was set for 2 p.m., so I left early to make sure I wouldn't be late. On the way, I sent a message to my friend Ryan, who lived near the area, telling him I was headed to an interview and that if all went well, we could celebrate afterward. As I drove, I started to feel a slight unease. The town seemed quieter than usual, and the sky was overcast, giving the surroundings a strange, eerie vibe. I arrived at the address around 1:45 p.m. and started looking for the cafe mentioned in the email. That's when something began to feel off. The address didn't lead to a cafe, but to an abandoned construction site. The surrounding buildings were unfinished, surrounded by scaffolding and abandoned construction materials. There were no signs of any recent activity. For a moment, I thought I had made a mistake. I checked the email again, confirming the address, but it was correct. This made me uneasy. I parked the car and got out to explore the area. The place was deserted, except for a luxury car parked a little further ahead. A well-dressed man stepped out of the car and started walking toward me. He seemed to be waiting for someone, perhaps me. As I walked toward the man, the feeling that something was seriously wrong grew stronger with every step. The environment around me felt more threatening than ever, and the silence was almost deafening. As I got closer, the man smiled in a strange way, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was wearing an impeccable suit, and his car, an expensive, shiny model, seemed out of place in the abandoned setting. "You must be Alex," he said, his voice formal but devoid of any warmth. "I'm the representative from Orion Dynamics. The interview will be a little different than you expected." I tried to maintain my composure despite the growing fear. "I was expecting to meet at a cafe. The email mentioned a specific location," I responded, trying to sound confident, but my voice wavered slightly. The man shrugged as if that detail was irrelevant. "We changed the plans. I thought this place would be more quiet for discussing the details. Why don't you get in the car? We can talk while I take you to the office." Every fiber of my being told me to get out of there, but I felt pressured to maintain politeness. I was in an uncomfortable situation, alone in a deserted place, with a man who seemed anything but trustworthy. My mind was racing, trying to find a way out without seeming rude or scared. "I'd prefer to discuss things here outside," I said, trying to mask my hesitation. After all, I wasn't expecting a car ride. The man frowned, clearly displeased with my response. "Let's not make this difficult, Alex. Just get in the car, and everything will become clear." His insistence only heightened my alertness. This wasn't professional behavior, and the thought of getting into that car was terrifying. My heart started racing, and I realized I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. "Sorry, but I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, beginning to back away. "Maybe it's better if we reschedule this interview for a more suitable location." As I spoke, the man took a step forward, blocking my exit. The fear I had been suppressing started to turn into panic. "It won't take long, Alex. Just get in the car." Without thinking twice, I grabbed my phone and, with trembling fingers, sent a quick message to Ryan. "Help, construction site, near campus, come fast." The man noticed the movement, but before he could react, I made up an excuse and began to walk away. "I really need to go. Sorry for any inconvenience." I turned and started walking quickly, trying not to break into a run so as not to appear desperate, but the fear was so intense, it was hard to keep my composure. Every step I took away from the man felt like an immense effort. My whole body was tense, and I could feel his eyes burning into my back. He didn't follow me immediately, but I could sense his sinister presence, as if he were waiting for the right moment to act. The deserted construction site amplified the sound of my quickening footsteps, and the distance between us felt greater with each passing second. Panic was at the surface. All I wanted was to reach my car, but I knew he could stop me at any moment. I forced myself not to look back, focusing on maintaining a steady pace and appearing calm, even though I was on the verge of losing control. Suddenly, I heard the sound of footsteps speeding up behind me. My heart pounded even faster, and at that moment, I decided to run. I dropped any pretense of staying calm and bolted toward my car, feeling the panic consume me. The keys were in my hand, and I knew I had to be fast. If I tripped or hesitated for even a second, I didn't know what might happen. As I ran, I heard a car approaching quickly. I turned my head, and to my surprise and relief, I saw Ryan's car rounding the corner and entering the construction site. He drove straight toward me, honking to get my attention and the man's. Ryan's arrival was like a beacon of hope in the midst of my desperation. The man, realizing that Ryan had arrived, stopped abruptly. His expression changed, and he took a step back, clearly frustrated at being interrupted. Ryan didn't hesitate. He pulled up beside me, and I opened the passenger door and threw myself inside without even looking back. "Get us out of here now," I shouted, barely able to control the tremor in my voice. Ryan floored the accelerator, and we sped away from there, leaving the man and the construction site behind. My heart was still racing, and adrenaline was coursing through my body. I couldn't believe what had just happened. If Ryan hadn't shown up in time, I didn't know how it would have ended. The whole drive back to campus, I stayed silent, trying to process everything. Ryan kept giving me concerned looks, but waited until I was ready to talk. When I finally calmed down enough, I told him what had happened, from the strange invitation for the interview to the moment he showed up to save me. "I knew something was off," Ryan said, shaking his head. "That place is known to be dangerous, and this story about an interview at a construction site, it sounded too suspicious. I'm glad you called me." I knew he was right. I had been naive to ignore the warning signs, but I also knew I had learned an important lesson. I would never again underestimate my instincts or fail to pay attention to the details. That experience left me shaken, and the confidence I had in internship opportunities would never be the same. When we finally arrived back on campus, Ryan gave me a strong hug, and I thanked him deeply for acting so quickly. Without him, I don't know what would have happened. The fear I felt at that construction site still haunted me, but the relief of being safe was indescribable. That night, lying in my bed, I reflected on how close I had come to something potentially catastrophic. I promised myself I would be more cautious in the future, valuing safety above all else. And above all, I learned that in critical moments, having someone you can trust makes all the difference. The week of Halloween was always the busiest on campus, and that year was no different. The fraternities and sororities had gone all out with decorations, filling every corner of the university with spiderwebs, carved pumpkins, and flashing lights. The Halloween party that night promised to be one of the biggest, and I was excited to join my friends and enjoy the fun. Dressed in an elaborate witch costume, I completed the look with dark makeup and a pointed hat. We met up in the dormitory and headed together to the fraternity where the party was being held. The house was packed, and the loud music made the floor vibrate. People danced, laughed, and the energy was contagious. At first, everything was going well. We drank, took pictures, and mingled with the crowd. But as the night wore on, the house became increasingly crowded, and the atmosphere more chaotic. At some point, I lost track of my friends. I searched for them on the dance floor and in the hallways, but the confusion of the party and the sheer number of people made it impossible to find them. I decided to step outside for some fresh air and see if they had gone out too. The night was cold, and the cool air was a welcome relief after the suffocating heat of the party. I walked around the fraternity house but saw no sign of my friends. As I explored the surroundings, something in the distance caught my attention. An old, visibly worn-down building was decorated with Halloween lights and spooky figures. It seemed like part of the celebrations, perhaps an improvised haunted house. Curiosity pulled me towards the building. The idea of a Halloween attraction seemed interesting, and who knows, maybe my friends were there. Still a little buzzed from the party, I decided to investigate. After all, Halloween was about getting scared and having fun, and I didn't want to miss out on anything that night. Without thinking too much, I started walking toward the building, ready to see what it had in store. As I got closer, I realized the building was even older than it had appeared from a distance. The walls were covered in moss, and the windows, some broken and others just dirty, were like vacant eyes staring back at me. The Halloween lights decorating the entrance flickered erratically, casting strange shadows everywhere. A cold wind blew, making the dry leaves swirl around my feet. For a moment, I felt a shiver down my spine, but I shook it off and continued forward. After all, it was just decoration. The door was ajar, creaking slightly as it moved with the wind. I thought it might be part of the party, some sort of haunted house, so I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was even darker than outside, lit only by a few hanging bulbs that flickered occasionally, casting faint glimmers of light into the corners of the hallway. The place was eerily quiet, except for my footsteps echoing across the creaking wooden floor. At first, I thought it was a prank, someone trying to scare the people who entered. but as I ventured deeper into the building, I began to realize I might have been wrong. The rooms I passed were empty, except for old, dust-covered furniture. Doors creaked slightly, pushed by drafts, and the air was thick with the smell of mold. What I had thought was a Halloween attraction was starting to feel more like a genuinely abandoned building. I tried to convince myself it was all part of the plan, but the discomfort began to grow. As I walked down a narrow corridor, I heard something that made my heart race. Footsteps. Someone else was there with me. I stopped immediately, straining to listen more closely. The footsteps were slow but steady, echoing through the corridors in a threatening manner. I looked around, but saw no one. "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded weaker than I expected, and the echo bounced back at me as if mocking my fear. There was no answer, just the sound of the footsteps, which now seemed to be getting closer. What had started as a fun adventure was now turning into something much darker. I began to walk faster, trying to remember the way back, but the building felt like a maze, and every corridor I turned down only led me further into the darkness. The fear fully set in when I realized the doors I had passed through earlier were now locked. I was trapped. My heart pounded in my chest as I searched for an exit, anything that would lead me back outside. The footsteps behind me continued, accompanied by heavy breathing, almost animal-like. Whoever was there wasn't playing games. I was being chased, and the thought that I might not get out alive sent me into a panic. I started to run, stumbling over debris and pushing doors in the hopes of finding one that would open. The sound of the footsteps sped up too, only increasing my desperation. Now, more than ever, I knew I needed to get out of that place before it was too late. Panic fueled me as I ran aimlessly through the narrow, dark corridors of the building. Every door I tried was locked, and every corner I turned seemed to lead me deeper into that terrifying maze. Behind me, the footsteps grew faster, accompanied by the sound of something being dragged, maybe a chain or something else I couldn't see and didn't want to imagine. I was nearly out of breath, my heart racing and my legs trembling, but I knew stopping wasn't an option. If I got caught, I had no idea what might happen, and that was the most terrifying thought of all. The heavy breathing of my pursuer was now so close, it seemed like they were right behind me. That's when I saw a small door to my right, almost hidden in the darkness. Without thinking, I threw myself against it, hoping it wasn't locked. To my relief, the door gave way, and I tumbled into a small, cramped room, apparently an old office. There was nowhere to go, but at least the door closed behind me, putting a temporary barrier between me and the danger. I locked the door with the old key that was in the lock and backed away, trying to control my ragged breathing. The silence returned for a brief moment, but it was shattered when I heard the door in the hallway being forced open. My pursuer was on the other side, trying to get in. I knew the door wouldn't hold for long. I desperately looked around the room, searching for an escape. There was a small window covered with wooden boards, but it seemed like my only chance. Without thinking twice, I began pulling at the boards with all the strength I had left. They were old and brittle, and finally gave way, creating a narrow opening just big enough for me to squeeze through. As the sound of breaking wood echoed, the door behind me gave way, and I knew my time was up. With one last effort, I squeezed through the window, feeling the wood scrape my skin and tear my costume. I fell outside, landing in a narrow, poorly lit courtyard, but I didn't stop. Even with aching knees and an exhausted body, I started running again. The night outside was cold, but the fresh breeze was a relief after the oppressive heat of the building. I could hardly believe I had managed to escape. The sound of footsteps behind me had vanished, but I couldn't risk looking back. I kept running, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that cursed place. Finally, I reached a more lit area of the campus, where I saw a group of students walking and laughing, completely unaware of the nightmare I had just escaped. I nearly stumbled as I approached them, but the sight of other people gave me the courage I needed. They looked at me in surprise, and one of them asked what had happened. I could barely speak, still in shock, but I managed to say enough for them to understand that I was in danger. One of the students, a girl dressed as a vampire, offered me a bottle of water and told me I should sit down. I thanked her, but the idea of staying there so close to the building made me nervous. I needed to get out of there, find my friends, and forget that night had ever happened. With their help, I made it back to the fraternity house where the party was still going on, but I wasn't the same anymore. When I finally found my friends, they were worried, not knowing where I had gone. I tried to explain what had happened, but everything seemed confused and surreal. The joy of the night had turned into a nightmare I knew I would never forget. After that night, Halloween was never the same for me. What should have been a fun party became a terrifying reminder of how danger can lurk in the shadows, even on a night of celebration.